this was actually what UNCTAD said, the UN Conference on Trade and Development, sometime in the middle of this year. They had actually said that that developing countries can no longer achieve their ambitions set out in the Agenda 2030 and the Paris Agreement due to the pandemic. And then the Agenda 2030, as you all know, is the Sustainable Development Goals. And why the pandemic? I think the multiple crises and the rising indebtedness, the challenges in the economic recovery, the COVID response, all that added to the climate crisis. And delivering on those ambitions will require international cooperation between the North and the South on a coordinated and unprecedented scale across a series of deeply connected international, economic, social, and environmental challenges, with the estimates that the required additional investments amount to a minimum of 2% of global GDP annually, which is upwards of US 1.7 trillion per year for the next few decades. Next slide, please. So the scale of the challenge is really fundamental. And then the needs of the developing countries that was expressed in their nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement, which actually kicked off in 2020, from 2021 to 2030. And these needs were before the pandemic hit. And what was in the NDCs, this is from the biennial, the Needs Determination Report of the Standing Committee on Finance, which is a committee under the UNFCCC. Basically, what they said was that it was 5.7 to 5.8 trillion by 2030, and of this, 502 billion is needed in terms of international support. So this is for the implementation of the existing NDCs. And on the adaptation needs, because we always have to look at this from the perspective of not just mitigation and the energy transition, but we also do need to look at adaptation and adaptation needs. You can see the scale is in the order of more than 140 billion to 300 billion to 500 billion to even the Global Commission on Adaptation saying 1.8 trillion from 2020 to 2030. So a number of ranges, but the issue is the scale is actually quite phenomenal. Next, please. And this is only adaptation. We're not talking about loss and damage, which I will come to later. Then you have this magic number of the 100 billion per year, goal per year by 2020 through to 2025. The developed countries actually said this in Copenhagen. If you remember the Copenhagen Accord, which was actually the whole Copenhagen talks collapsed. And then in Cancun, that was reaffirmed that they agreed to mobilize 100 billion per year by 2020. This figure was not based on any assessment of needs. We all say that it is picked up from a hat by the Secretary of State then, Hillary Clinton, when they were in Cancun. And the developed world has failed to meet this promise. And in 2015 in Paris, this goal was shifted to 2025. Next, please. So the 100 billion, just to very quickly go through how did they meet, did they not meet? And you have always have this OECD doing some kind of an assessment, and they put out and they actually escalate and exaggerate the number. And they looked at, then they say that 78.9 billion in 2018, mitigation was 70%, adaptation 21%, and then the remaining for cross-cutting. Share of loans is actually much larger. And so you can see that the shares of grants actually decreased from 27% to 20% between 2013 to 2018. And so the focus is always also on private climate finance. And if you remember Mark Carney in Glasgow, the former governor of Bank of England, talking about how many trillions that is there out in the world, which is private sector and so on, which they're willing to invest, which is a lot of bullshit. Sorry, did I use the wrong word? But anyway, we all know that. Next, please. And so the next slide, please. So I think one slide before, I think there was an Oxfam report, unless I removed the wrong slide. No, before this, I'm sorry. After that is, yes, the Oxfam Climate Finance Shadow Report, which they actually looked at the OECD report, and what Oxfam actually has shown is that climate-specific net assistance between 2017 to 2018 was 19 to 22 billion dollars actually. So the rest of it is all fluff, and they add ODA and others. And then reported public climate finance for adaptation was only 25%, mitigation 66%, and grants being very little compared to loans. And what is really even shocking is that climate finance to small island developing states, 50% of it is loans. Climate finance to LDCs, 66% in loans. Next slide, please. So already these countries are in debt, and yet you have a lot of loans which are going. And this is the MDB, the Multilateral Development Bank's finance report, total climate finance in 2020, 66 billion is what they claim, out of which 40% went to Europe and the EU. And again, mitigation finance trumps adaptation, and there's nothing on loss and damage. Next, please. So if you look at the definition of climate finance, this is why these varying numbers. This is something that India, particularly India in the negotiations, together with the like-minded, India actually leads the negotiations for the like-minded developing countries. About 20 countries belong to that, including China and others. And so the key issue that was being pushed is the definition of climate finance, which is very, very key for operational definition, so that you don't count mother, father, grandfather, daughter, cat, dog, everything into that, because that's what happens. So this lack of an agreed operational definition is the reason why you see a lot of mumbo jumbo in the numbers. Next, please. So where are we with the UNFCCC funds? Just to give you a landscape of what's there, the Global Environment Facility, this is actually housed in the World Bank. And the GEF replenishment, the most recent replenishment, was only 40% less than the previous replenishment, meaning it was less, it was reduced by 40%. So that's shocking. In a time when you actually have to increase, they actually decreased. And then the Green Climate Fund, what we have at the moment is, in the first replenishment, and at the moment, there is 10.3 billion that is pledged to the Green Climate Fund, which is really nothing compared to the scale that's needed. And then the Adaptation Fund, this depends on voluntary contributions from the developed countries. And in Glasgow, there was a $356 million which was pledged to the Adaptation Fund. So a lot of peanuts, as you can see, which is not really much. Next. So what did we get out of Glasgow? So there was this big fight on this discussion around long-term finance. The developed countries actually wanted this agenda item shut down, because basically what they said was, this is 2020 finance, we have talked about it enough, there is no need to carry on, so let's close this agenda item under the COP. So developing countries fought back very hard. They said, no, your 100 billion hasn't been met, we need to continue. So the final outcome in Glasgow was actually to continue the long-term finance discussion until 2027. And this is seen as a win, a small win, a significant win. But to even get this was like really, really difficult. And so, this was important nevertheless. And then there's also a process which was agreed by under this agenda item for the Standing Committee on Finance to actually ensure that they monitor the delivery, the process to review the delivery of the 100 billion goal, which will be done, and who will report progress already at the next COP. Now, on the definition of climate finance, developing countries were unable to have a climate definition. The agreement was climate definitions. So another fight, but anyway, at least we managed to get something there that you have to actually discuss how do you define climate finance or finances. So this is very important, and this is something that the SEF will have to continue to do. There will be also COP27, Egypt who will be hosting the COP, they will have to organize a high-level ministerial dialogue on climate finance. on the progress and the fulfillment of the 100 billion per year. And then there is also that they had agreed that there will be a high ministerial dialogue. Usually these are dialogues. So to what extent they actually translate into concrete deliverables is what we need to see. And there was a decision in Glasgow to significantly increase the provision of adaptation finance, including as appropriate as all qualifiers, considering another qualifier, doubling adaptation finance with the aim of achieving a balance between mitigation and adaptation. A lot of qualifiers. And so, the battle continues. Next, please. And then there is this what we talked about under the long-term finance agenda was the 100 billion and the pre-2020 commitment. And then there is this new collective goal on finance, new collective quantified goal on finance. In Paris, it was already agreed that by 2025, there would be a new collective goal based on the needs of developing countries. I've already indicated to you what the NDCs of developing countries contain. And so the developing countries were pushing for a robust process to ensure that you don't have just talk shops and workshops and seminars, but you actually have a process. So there's an ad hoc work program from 2022 to 2024 under the Conference of Parties that deals with the Paris Agreement to facilitate and to be facilitated by a co-chair from the developed world and the developing world. And they are supposed to have this between November 2022 to November 2023, and they will conduct some expert dialogues and so on. Now, you can read the rest of it, but what's important is really that inputs from groups, including academia, expert groups, civil society, are welcomed to actually give inputs in terms of ascertaining the needs of developing countries. And I think it's very critical for the academia and those of you who are following this conference to take this opportunity to actually, provide these inputs in relation to the quantity, the quality, the scope, and the access features, as well as, all kinds of the needs that developing countries will need. And these are very important. So if we could do this, it would be very important contribution to the inputs and we will be helping our developing countries also with their capacity. The next slide, please. So those were the major highlights on the finance side, small steps, but important steps. On adaptation, it's a very important outcome that we were pushing, the developing countries were pushing. If you recall, Article 7 of the Paris Agreement talks about establishing a global goal on adaptation. And this is to actually ensure that the parties don't just focus on a goal on mitigation, which is the temperature goal, but also have a global goal on adaptation to enhance the adaptive capacity, to strengthen resilience, to reduce vulnerability to climate change, and with a view to contributing to sustainable development and ensuring adequate adaptation response in the context of the temperature goal, which is the 2 degree to 1.5 limit. And that was important. Now, so since then, developing countries have been calling for a concrete process on an elaboration of the global goal on adaptation. Developed countries were opposing this, but we managed to get in Glasgow that adaptation is recognized as important. At least there was a lot of political statements to that. We got a 2-year Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh work program on the global goal on adaptation, which will begin next year. And the objective, among many others of the Sharm el-Sheikh program, is to enable the full and sustained implementation towards achieving the global goal on adaptation with the view to enhance adaptation action and support, and also to understand the global goal on adaptation, including the methodologies, the indicators, the data, the metrics, the needs, and all this in relation to how do you actually see whether you have met the adaptation goal. So developed countries urged to at least double their collective provision of finance. This I already mentioned. So these were the major outcomes in relation to adaptation. My next slide, which is actually my last slide, on loss and damage. Now, in case for many of you, if you're not aware of why loss and damage, this was a big fight. Even before the Paris Agreement, it was already in Warsaw. where this was a very big discussion because there was a realization among the developing world that there's a limit to what you can adapt, because we are already in the time frame of slow onset events which are beyond adaptation, like your whole coastal areas being eroded, or your sea level rise, or your salinization of the coast. And then you have extreme weather events which are increasing in frequency, intensity, and so on, which we've all witnessed, including the forest fires, the flooding, the droughts, and so on, which we will see increase phenomenally. So there was this what push for having loss and damage as a very important pillar, and that was achieved actually in Paris under another Article 8 actually on loss and damage. Was very, very important. So the expectations actually towards Glasgow was for additional finance from the developed countries, to talk, even not just about talking, but actually some kind of a commitment to say that finance for adaptation is important. For loss and damage is important. Not the number, but at least to recognize and acknowledge that. And so that we can have an effective mechanism for loss and damage. And what happened in Madrid in 2019 was the establishment of what's called the Santiago Network on Loss and Damage to support developing countries at the technical level. And this was important because there's a lot of work and capacity and research that's needed on loss and damage. So that was agreed to. And so a third issue was actually the governance of the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage, whether it belongs to the COP under the convention or whether it's a Paris Agreement that is under the Paris Agreement. So the reason why that is there, because the reason that we got this particular article in the Paris Agreement to recognize loss and damage was another decision in Paris which said that this does not mean that this is liability and compensation for loss and damage, because the United States was very clear. They did not want loss and damage to be associated with compensation or reparations and so on. So that was clear. So if the Paris Agreement language is looked at together with this decision, then the US and its allies want the governance of this loss and damage institution to only be under the Paris Agreement and not under the COP. And so there's a big fight, and this fight is continuing. So the outcomes in Glasgow: no additional finance. Instead of calls for a facility, the Glasgow dialogue was established, and where developing countries are expected to raise the issue of financing loss and damage. And so it's a dialogue to talk. Now, then there's super red line for the US to have anything on finance for loss and damage. This is their super red line. So what the US doesn't want, the whole world has to agree. And this is what the big bullying happened. This was one of the big bullyings that happened. So the functions of the Santiago Network on Loss and Damage, that was agreed. So that was a good win. But the governance issue was not sorted out. So I don't think the next slide, is there anything else? None, right? There's no more. That's my final slide.
No, that's the last one.
Yeah, so I can go back to the main gallery and I'll have some final wrap-up comments. So what we got in Glasgow was actually very difficult, but nevertheless important. And we continue to engage in the international processes, largely because you do need, this will grow, the financing will grow. And for countries that do not have, your national budgets going into COVID recovery or other kinds of recovery, even the phase out of coal. I was looking forward to reading your coal and renewables book, but I see that what will it take in terms of numbers is something I'd like to really understand. What is the meaning of moving from the phase down to an eventual phase out, not only of coal but other fossil fuels as well. That's a very important piece of work that we need to do and we need to explore.